Hello everyone, we're starting off tonight with a topic that isn't typically included in high school history textbooks or war movies: food, in particular trench food, the magnificent, gritty, sometimes frightening fuel that kept millions of soldiers alive, barely, during World War I. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. The British troops prioritised basic survival and a slight sense of disappointment over enjoyment when it came to trench cuisine. Their daily rations sound like the opening of a horror novel from the Victorian era. Hardtack biscuits, bully meat, and numerous mugs of tea that are a little muddy. First, let's talk about bully beef. It was corned beef in a can, kept in gelatinous fat, and sealed in tins that could only be opened with a rock, a bayonet, or supernatural intervention. It tasted like something that may have been meat in a previous life, and it had the consistency of regret. Assuming they could find a fire that wasn't being bombarded, soldiers either cooked it, put it on crackers, or ate it cold. Then came the hardtack, sometimes known as dog biscuits or toothbreakers. These were dry, solid crackers that were resistant to small guns fire, water, and time. To make them chewable, many soldiers soaked them in soup or tea. Some said they were merely reissued after being manufactured during the Boer War. It's not a joke, logistics that is. Now tea, to wash it all away. It's dark, sweet, and sturdy enough to hold a spoon up. In the British ration, it was the only reassuring item. It was provided before a charge, during a gas assault, after burying a friend, and at all times and in all circumstances. Although the quality of the rations varied greatly, one officer asserted that tea had saved more British lives than any bulletproof vest. It was common for frontline troops to go days without new supplies. Food may have been rotten, wet, or stolen by more shrewd rats when it arrived. Some soldiers devised satirical names such as trench pudding to stews made with scrap, bully meat, biscuit crumbs, and a dash of desperation. Additionally, the British distributed a strange dish known as Mackinockey stew, which is a canned mixture of turnips, potatoes, and fat that has a subtle death odour. It tasted like grief when eaten cold, a little less heated up. The French method was a daily act of culinary rebellion, whereas the British trench diet was a test of endurance. French soldiers, known as poilus, attempted to maintain mealtimes tied to some kind of civilization, despite the mud, barbed wire, artillery, and death all around them. Bread was the cornerstone of the French ration, a lot of it. Loaves of crusty pain de campagne were delivered to soldiers in sacks carried over mules. These loaves were frequently produced in large quantities. Was it fresh all the time? No way. Despite being stale, the French bread outperformed British hardtack in terms of both taste and dental risk. Cheese, occasionally canned meat, and occasionally beans or sardines were served with the bread. However, one item almost always arrived, regardless of the remainder of the dinner: wine. Yes, regular wine rations of roughly half a litre per day were provided to French soldiers in spite of the atrocities of trench warfare. The place was not Chateau Margaux. Typically, it was sour, weak, and better drank right away before the cork realized it wasn't a seal. However, it boosted spirits and reassured soldiers that they were still French, or at least human. Some soldiers made an effort to cook correctly despite the muck and their insanity. They constructed makeshift stoves out of recycled materials or metal tins. Men would use bayonets to stir stews, simmer leftover meat, and heat water in helmets. In shell casings, one sergeant famously prepared omelettes. How he obtained the eggs was not questioned. Nobody was interested in finding out. Military authorities were more concerned about wine shortages than munitions, because the pinard, or wine, became so culturally essential. They could withstand machine gun fire, but not dry canteens, soldiers laughed. However, supply weren't always reliable. Food may arrive with shell holes or deteriorate in transportation during prolonged bombardments. It was frequently necessary to share, barter, or steal rations. However, the French soldiers' spirit was evident. If you must endure suffering, at least do it while sipping wine, eating something that slightly resembles cheese, and enjoying a crust of bread. German soldiers ate unusually well in the early stages of the conflict. The rations were substantial, well-planned, and efficiently German. Strong black coffee, potatoes, sauerkraut, smoked meats, sausages, and dark rye bread. If you disregarded the rats, the dirt, and the shrieking shells above, it briefly resembled a rustic picnic. But the German diet changed quickly and in a dismal way as the war continued and the Allied blockade tightened. Greetings from the era of Ersatz, which means not quite food, but approximately translates to replacement. Roasted barley, chicory, or acorns were used to make coffee substitutes. Drinking it seemed like punishment, although it had a faint coffee scent. Sawdust, potato starch, and anything the quartermaster said was nutritive were examples of substitute flour. The replacement meat was packaged in cans which did not identify the animal and might not have included one. But the German soldiers' go-to food was black bread, dense, sour, and resistant to the humidity of the trench. It was essentially a defensive weapon. It might be used as a sandbag, eaten, or used to kill a rat in a single blow. Some even asserted that it was impervious to shrapnel. They were correct. Meat became a thing of the past as things deteriorated. The focus was on thin soups with unidentified components, turnips, and cabbage. They valued fat. Lard or bacon grease became social currency if someone could obtain it. For a smear of something that could lessen the soul-destroying effects of boiled turnip soup, soldiers would exchange cigarettes, additional boots, and even ammo. Nevertheless, German soldiers continued to be resourceful in spite of the deterioration. Field kitchens continued to function. In between bombardments, some made makeshift ovens, others traded with nearby residents, and yet others gathered what they could. Creativity is fostered by desperation, and many of the stews that came out of the trenches were both horrible and strangely successful. Nevertheless, nothing more reflected the shift than the switch from sausage to ersatz sausage, a culinary disaster that plagued Western Front diners. Many German troops were suffering from physical and nutritional exhaustion by 1918. Hunger was more than simply an inconvenience. It was a strategic breakdown. The soldiers sensed it. The war effort did the same. It's difficult to feed an army. Supplying a multi-ethnic empire with a supply chain in disarray, a dozen different languages, and no consistent menu. That was the particular masochism of the Austro-Hungarian military. With warriors from Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Croatia, Poland, and other countries, the empire spanned from Vienna to Sarajevo. Each of these nations had its own national cuisine and nutritional customs. What happened in the trenches? A lukewarm crisis of gastronomic identity. Standard rations included soup, the all-time solution to what's left in the wagon, and black bread, which was always dense and occasionally moldy. Beans, barley, dried peas, turnips, old potatoes, or a bone with sentimental significance could all be included in the soup, occasionally, simultaneously. It was known affectionately or resentfully as Eintopf, which translates to one pot, and also refers to the army's overall dietary plan. The Hungarian soldiers frequently missed stews with a lot of paprika. Dumplings were missed by the Czechs. The Slovenians yearned for something non-grey. The cooks, though, they made do with the resources at their disposal, which were rarely sufficient. Lard was a saviour, appearing prominently. It was used in soups, slathered on toast, and sometimes, in extreme cases, consumed with a spoon. Dietary? Possibly. Tasty? No. Calories, however, always outperformed cuisine in trench combat. It was a logistical nightmare. Supplies were lost, redirected, or delayed. Some soldiers went days without eating a full meal, which resulted in them stealing, foraging, or repurposing horses for stew, often without consulting the animals themselves. When circumstances permitted, certain regional units were able to cook regional cuisine utilizing resources from the countryside or by bartering with locals. However, the majority of soldiers merely attempted to make it through the central kitchen's culinary roulette, not to mention coffee, or at least a dark beverage with that name. Actually, it was frequently beet pulp or toasted grain posing as caffeine. In any case, soldiers drank it. It was a little less depressing than cold water, but it was hot and harsh. Throughout the end, trench food throughout Austria-Hungary was shared rather than unified. There was also a peculiar sense of camaraderie in that suffering. After all, you're bound for life if you can make it through shellfire and cooked turnip stew in the same afternoon. In some way, Russian rations made everyone else appear overfed, even if trench food in Europe was grim. Supported by traditional faith and incredibly low expectations, the Russian soldiers' diet during World War I was an exercise in austere suffering. The mainstay? Dense and sour, black bread is typically frozen solid during the winter months. It was shattered on rocks or sliced with bayonets. Congratulations if you were able to chew it without breaking a molar. Halfway to sustenance, you were. Salo followed next. Pig fat, slabs that have been cured and served, chilled. Pure fat, no ceremony, no spices. It was not nibbled by Russians. It was like candy bars to them, dietary, indeed, tasty. Only if you've been so traumatized that you don't care. When it was accessible, buckwheat porridge, or kasha, was a regular sight. It was one of the few dinners that looked like something you might choose to eat, hearty, satisfying, and thankfully, warm. Nevertheless, it frequently arrived unseasoned and in amounts that are best characterized as symbolic. For most troops, the closest thing to a hot meal was cabbage soup, or shchi. It was thin, watery, and heavy in cabbage, and it was said to depress spirits by 12% per tablespoon. Every now and then a wayward bone or an enigmatic mass would rise to the surface, met with applause and intense mistrust. How about meat? Philosophical and uncommon. When meat did show up, it was either grey, old, or maybe equine. Nobody inquired. The majority of soldiers crossed the thin line every day between starvation and dignity. Already spanning a vast kingdom, the Russian supply lines were remarkably disorganized. Food was frequently delivered to soldiers late, if at all. They turned to boiling bark, pillaging nearby towns, or simply gnawing on their own sorrows during protracted offensives. Then there was vodka, the Russian army's unofficial ration. When it was accessible, it served as a pain reliever, a morale enhancer, and a soup substitute if consumed quickly enough. Unfortunately, it frequently smelled like furniture polish and was diluted down or substituted with substances that only vaguely resembled vodka. Ultimately, Russian trench food was more about surviving than it was about what you ate. You were thankful if it had calories and didn't fight back. And it was a miracle if it arrived warm. Or a trap. In 1917, the Americans finally arrived with new hope, new glittering equipment, and a strong conviction that their food was superior to everyone else's. In a technical sense, it was. If you evaluated meals based on their calorie content rather than their emotional impact, the reserve ration was the main component of every American soldier's meal. Coffee, sugar, salt, hardtack biscuits, tinned meat, and the most American of condiments, 3 smokes every meal, are all carefully arranged in a death row. Indeed, smokes were served as part of meals by the US soldiers. Lung health could wait. Flavor was obviously out of the question. First, let's talk about the meat. Fork-resistant is the best way to characterize the consistency of corned beef hash that is canned. It was cold, like padding in carpet. It was hot, like the padding of steamy carpet. The soldiers called it goldfish. It arrived in tins and made you miss home-cooked meals that didn't taste like misery, not because it swam. The bacon followed. Up until you opened the box, it was theoretically a morale boost. It came greasy, greyish, and so salty you could preserve a horse with it. It was chewy when eaten uncooked. If you hadn't eaten since Belgium, it turned somewhat palatable when fried. However, the true American trench classic was beans. They transported it baked, canned, floating, dry, or any combination of these. The soldiers soon discovered that nothing unites men like sharing a dugout and eating beans together. But coffee was the actual idol of the Yanks. It was the trench version of holy water, served black, bitter, hotter than your rifle barrel, and brewed with enough strength to remove paint. It was poured from kettles that hadn't been cleaned since Fort Leavenworth, and that was on a good day. Not to mention chewing gum, which is purposefully provided to reduce stress, slow down tooth decay, and possibly prevent you from biting your own fingers while shelling. To be true, American rations were unusual by European standards, but they were also dependable. Although they were flavorless, they were punctual, did not retaliate, and infrequently included live worms. But even the Germans began to feel less menacing than another question mark for breakfast after 5 days of beans and hash. It's never easy to feed an army throughout a huge dominion. With one foot in the 20th century and the other in total logistical chaos, the Ottoman Empire's trench kitchen fed an army over deserts, mountains, and crumbling infrastructure. Rations for the typical Ottoman soldier, who was frequently Turkish, Arab, Kurdish, or from other distant areas, were limited, monotonous, and precisely matched to cause gastronomic anguish. Lentils were the mainstay. Lentils were the mainstay of the trench diet, whether they were boiled into mush, fried into patties, or just looked upon in quiet. By necessity, not by choice. The next major hit was onions. If you could discover fire, you could eat it raw, pickled, or roasted. Emotionally painful, but nutritionally sound. Then there was flatbread, which was good when it was fresh, but it was scarce in the trenches. When it solidified, it may be used as emergency sandals or armor plate. Meat, we must refrain from greed. When it came, it was often gamey, chewy, salty lamb or goat, and old enough to recall the Crimean War. The majority of troops only saw flesh in their nightmares or on unusual occasions. They survived in the interim by eating rice, bulgur, or anything else that didn't resist in the supply pack. Ottoman supply chains were notoriously slow and often failed. Soldiers themselves carried food on their backs in carts or on mules. Supplies were drenched if it rained. They were spoilt if it was sunny. They were stolen if the weather was neutral. There was no victory. Many Ottoman soldiers were good field cooks to their credit. They could transform rations into something that looked like food with just a dented pot, a dash of cumin, and their own determination. To be clear, however, this was not exquisite dining. It was creative survival. What is the true tragedy? No coffee. Not the good kind, anyway. Proper Turkish coffee, once a mainstay of the empire, was lost in the conflict. It was replaced by a thin, bitter beverage made from roasted acorns or chickpeas. Poetry was not inspired by it. The British ration system was passed down to Canadian soldiers as they joined the war under British leadership. This implied that they were also endowed with the holy trinity of tea, hardtack, bully beef, and trench food. However, the attitude was distinctly Canadian, even though the food was the same. The dreadful bully beef, which is colder and potentially frozen solid, is still the same tin of shimmering crushed remorse that was given to the British. Unopened cans were reportedly used as ice bricks by Canadian troops during the winter. For safety, they simply kept them closed over the summer. Another delight was hardtack, the biscuit version of a slab of concrete. It was flavorless, dry, and sometimes dated back to the last conflict. To avoid needing emergency dental surgery, soldiers dipped it in tea, soup, or anything else that was sufficiently moist. After the battle, a Canadian private said he used his as a doorstop. It was a perfect success. Then there was tea, of course. Hot, strong, and brewed whenever possible. Canadian soldiers were spotted hiding behind sandbags, clutching steaming enamel mugs as if to ward off devils, even in the face of shelling. Tea wasn't a beverage. It was a caffeine-infused national identity. Some Canadians brought in-house morale boosters, in contrast to their British counterparts. Some maple syrup that was smuggled from home, perhaps a prairie aunt's molasses cookies in a tin. Since it's difficult to eat while someone is staring at you with icy eyes, these delicacies were uncommon and naturally shared with everyone, not to mention the bacon. Every time someone dared to attempt drawing artillery, it was fried over makeshift fires and served in large chunks of fatty, salty meat. Canadians quickly discovered that bacon is delicious until a rat attempts to take it in the middle of sizzling. The Canadian supply system tended to operate a little more effectively, or at least more inventively, even if it was still dependent on the Empire's wider logistics network. Rations were exchanged, stretched, and sometimes released from units with fewer lookouts in the vicinity. India responded to the British Empire's appeal by sending over 1 million soldiers to fight in a conflict that had little to do with them, and even fewer to provide them the food they were accustomed to. Indian soldiers rapidly discovered that trench rations were more about identity loss by the spoonful than they were about survival, especially for those who adhered to stringent religious or cultural food regulations. Bully beef, hardtack and tea, the usual British ration, were entirely indigestible to many Indian soldiers. Everyone, regardless of ethnicity, was made to consume something that tasted like colonial apathy. Muslims were given pork, Hindus were served meat. To their credit, while being under fire, many Indian units refused to eat prohibited meats. Rather, they shared resources, cooked independently when permitted, and boiled sabzi, dal, or rice in anything from steel helmets to dented pots. On their best days, they were able to mimic basic recipes. On bad days, they prayed for divine intervention while boiling onions. Spices, which are essential to Indian cooking, were scarce unless they were smuggled into care packages or stolen from the stocks of British officers. Every dish tasted like Europe without them, wet, grey, and slightly bitter. Occasionally, British officers, who were always eager to misinterpret everything, attempted to make things better by releasing curried bully beef, which was simply ordinary bully beef with a dash of imperialism and a little remorse. Indian soldiers made do with what they had despite the humiliations. Lentils were soaked in mess tins, and chapatis were produced with trench flour that was fried on shovels. When there was time, meals were shared in the group, and some soldiers carried spice mixes in small cloth bags, which they guarded more carefully than their rifles. The dignity was thick, but the meal was thin. But religion was at stake here, not simply taste. In addition to being inconvenient, eating the wrong diet had devastating spiritual effects. To exist without compromising, some bartered with local inhabitants or other colonial forces, while others rejected meals for days. Along with the cold and starvation, Indian troops also had to deal with the feeling that the empire they served did not understand them at all. Nevertheless, they persisted, one cloud of steam fragrant with cumin at a time. African colonial troops under French and British rule were frequently stationed far from their homes and even farther from food that made sense to them. These guys, who were originally from Senegal, Algeria, Morocco, and other parts of the empire, carried their own culinary traditions with them and plunged headfirst into the tinned tragedy of Europe. To their credit, the French provided a little more edible rations than the British. However, a hunk of bread and a can of cold beef didn't satisfy the cravings of West African soldiers for spicy ground nut stew or millet porridge. Confusion was mostly scratched. Hardtack, canned beef, and the occasional piece of salted fish were standard issues. However, these meals had a severe digestive and spiritual conflict with the native diets. With the help of helmet lids, wood fires, and obstinate memory, several soldiers made their own makeshift kitchens directly behind the trenches. When accessible, rice was transformed into a nutritious food. A few scavenged spices, a handful of grains, and a pot of boiling water may evoke a sense of home. Smuggled, bartered, or foraged, dried okra, onions, and peppers made boring French rations somewhat recognizable. Using small tagines or metal pots, some Algerian and Moroccan households prepared slow-cooked stews that left their neighbors both bewildered and envious. They mixed, seasoned, and served even in the face of shelling, because it should at least smell like cumin if the end was near. However, the cultural misinterpretations were profound. Often, Muslim troops were given pork. Fasting for religious reasons was disregarded. Perplexed that their rations weren't loved by everyone, French superiors responded in the only manner colonial officers could, by accusing the men of being unappreciative. But the issue was not just about the food. Numerous African soldiers were viewed as disposable labor. They manned the most hazardous front lines, transported supplies, and dug trenches. When things became problematic, meals were either skipped completely, rushed, or unfairly rationed. Nevertheless, they used fire, spice, and inventiveness to cook, share, adapt, and fight against the big European flattening of taste. Pasta, polenta, and mama's ragu were in the Italian soldier's mind as he marched to battle. A cup of beans, a piece of military bread, and the bitter realization that no one prepares al dente under artillery fire were what he received. Italian troops faced one of the most difficult terrains of the war while fighting along the rocky Isonzo front. They had to use mules to carry their food through icy valleys and over rocky cliffs. Unless the mules were stolen, shelled, or just too miserable to go on, the typical ration, war bread, or pane di guerra, is a thick, greyish bread prepared from barley, wheat, and existential gloom. It was dry enough to remove the moisture from your recollections and strong enough to withstand shrapnel. This was accompanied by beans, which were often brown or white, boiled until they were submissive, and frequently flavored with melted snow and disappointment. The infrequent appearance of salt pork added salt and fat but little dignity. The rough, stringy meat was frequently cut with trench knives or inventive profanity directly from frozen slabs. Although both arrived cold, congealed, and far from lyrical, soldiers would receive macaroni or polenta if the supply lines lasted, a big if. It was nearly impossible to cook in the trenches, particularly when your fuel was half a fence post and your stove was a rusted shell casing. Then there was vino, the small Italian wine ration that produced primarily eyebrow-raising but did its best to raise spirits. It was sour and thin, more vineyard accident than Chianti elegance. In spite of this, a warm glass of red wine in a trench covered in snow served as a reminder that tables and chairs had previously been a part of existence. The enemy of logistics was ever present. Food froze before it reached the front in the cold. It spoiled in transport throughout the summer. Additionally, before you even opened the can, it was taken by rodents, police, or your own stomach. Italian soldiers continued to sing, eat, and occasionally even season in spite of everything. They would make trench risotto with extra mud if they couldn't make it home to Mama's kitchen. The Balkan front was mud, mountains, and a lot of cabbage, whereas the Western front was dirt and mustard gas. Here, combat was violent, disorderly, and often chilly. Additionally, the food consistently complemented the atmosphere. Serbian, Bulgarian, Montenegrin, and other Balkan armies tended to eat anything that could be cooked without going against the laws of physics. Onions, potatoes, and cabbage were widely available, reasonably priced, and resilient enough to withstand lengthy transportation. Sadly, so was the stench, which stuck to tents, uniforms, and most likely, the downwind enemy's nostrils. Soup served as the foundation for almost every meal. Light, oily, and prepared over blazing furniture if you weren't lucky, or over campfires if you were. Barley, beans, or a mysterious legume given by chance could all be found in a nice soup. Real meat, typically mutton, pork fat, or in extreme situations, a former military horse that served honourably and afterward, well, delightfully, may be included in a fantastic soup. Bread was sparse, but it was there when it was available. Biscuits were occasionally made by soldiers using flour and water, dried until they were as hard as stone, and used as both blunt tools and sustenance. On the poorer fronts of the war, coffee was uncommon and typically substituted with roasted barley or acorns. The resultant beverage, mostly served as a warm liquid placebo, had a mud-like appearance and smelled like firewood. Having been peasants prior to the war, many Balkan soldiers were accustomed to surviving on very little. The secret was improvisation. An occasional clove of garlic, a sprig of wild herbs, or a shred of smoked pork may turn a pail of boiling misery into something nearly nourishing. Nearly. Regretfully, the Balkans' supply routes were creative. Food was frequently transported by ox cart or pure luck. Roads were rudimentary and railroads were non-existent in many places. Incomplete, delayed, or non-existent rations were delivered. The ability to forage became essential. It was not uncommon to steal from deserted settlements, eggs for cigarettes, almost an Olympic sport. However, because nothing unites men like enduring the same pot of overdone cabbage, morale somehow managed to endure. POW meals made them appear luxurious, if trench rations were subpar. During World War I, captured troops were confined to camps where the only thing worse than the company was the food. Cooking, if you can call boiling misery into a pot. Soup was the typical POW meal in the majority of camps, including German, Russian, French, and British. Soup, always. Thin, grey, sometimes warm, and frequently referred to by survivors as hot liquid with floaters or watery cabbage. Nobody was aware of what floated, nobody wished to inquire. This culinary quagmire was accompanied by a piece of bread, typically stale and thick enough to be used as a bludgeon or doorstop. Sawdust or potato starch were frequently used to extend this bread, depending on who was acting as though it was still edible. Meat was legendary. It was measured in milligrams when it did show up. A piece of stale sausage, a bone that retains its flavor. Famously, a French prisoner of war camp once offered what they claimed to be meat, but was actually cooked rat. There were conflicting reviews. The rat remained silent. There were few calories, low level of starvation. During the first several weeks, many inmates experienced severe weight loss. A few adjusted. Others didn't. Starvation was prevalent in Russian camps where supply lines were essentially wishful thinking. As the war stretched on and supplies ran low, rations in German camps drastically decreased. The Red Cross package, a real lifesaver, comes next. Mostly from the British, these care packages contained tea, soap, biscuits, chocolate, and canned meat. They were cherished when they got there. Things became medieval when they didn't. Inmates would bet, trade, and protect their packages like dragons storing bottled milk. Some inmates even turned as camp cooks, preparing exquisite meals with the sparse supplies found in Red Cross parcels, mock roasts, biscuit pudding, and sardine pâté. All cooked on improvised stoves in cottages with dirt floors, watched over by guards who had little regard for culinary brilliance. Food turned into money. You could buy socks with a tin of jam. A chocolate bar, defense, a piece of actual bread, political leverage in practice. A forgotten man with a ladle and a 1,000-yard look stood behind each weary soldier chewing on mystery meat. The cook in the trench. These cooks weren't famous. They had neither aprons nor recipe books. In addition to shaky fires and dented pots, they faced the daily task of transforming military food into something that wasn't suitable for trench mortar. Disguised as soup-making apparatuses, field kitchens were mobile, wheeled machines pulled behind the lines. They were actually smoke-belching vessels filled with ambition, tea and stew. There was nearly always a scarcity, and cooks had to make do with what they had. Whenever the artillery indicated it could, a trench cook's day ended. Large quantities of meals that contained more preservatives than nutrients had to be prepared. The foundation consisted of salted pork, onions, turnips, and cabbage. Satire was typically used in place of flavor, which was optional. These cooks used nearly nothing to produce something reasonably appetizing in spite of the odds. They used more water than ingredients when making stews. Hardtack biscuits were rehydrated until they regained their bread-like consistency. For 30 men, they spread a handful of beans on a pot. If there were culinary miracles, they were hidden behind a cook cursing at his ladle in the back of a trench. The food still needed to be delivered, under fire, through barbed wire, across muck, and sometimes through places where rodents had asserted their right to squatter status. Cooks risked their lives pulling soup carts through hell to deliver a hot supper to soldiers who would risk everything for it. In order to prepare food without drawing opposing snipers' attention with their distinctive smoke plumes, some soldiers even constructed temporary fire trenches. These places became revered in cold weather. They turned into fly farms in the summer. Therapists were also field cooks. Soldiers asked for more bread, laughed with them, and grumbled to them. A competent cook might keep a unit going. A poor cook, well, they were short-lived. According to rumours, a British battalion nearly went on strike over oatmeal that had been burned. One thing was consistent on every front, every army, and every wretched trench after millions of bullets, thousands of kilometres of muck, and more cabbage than any battle could ever ask for. You remained human by eating. Seldom. Pleasure was not the purpose of trench food. Even nourishment wasn't always the issue. It had to do with calories that are tasteless, fatty, and dense, a bowl of rehydrated dread, enough to keep a man digging, shooting, marching, and crying every now and then. Soldiers learnt to survive without adequate utensils, without seasoning, and occasionally without chewing. They ate while lying in 6 inches of frigid water, standing, sprinting, or crouching. It was good if it was hot. It was better if it was solid. You had a nice day if it didn't move by itself. Food, however, evolved into something more. It was ritual under the worst circumstances. Making tea, dividing biscuits, and squabbling over the bread that's a tad less soggy. It was cozy. It was because you were still alive to taste it, not because it was delicious. A hot dinner could cheer people up more quickly than a speech. A friendship could begin with a tin of jam. A fist fight might break out over a missing ration. Food served as money, a kind of rehabilitation, a diplomatic tool, and perhaps the only thing keeping people from going insane. Every army had its peculiarities. The common experience was the same whether it was Ottoman lentils, American beans, Russian kasha, German black bread, French wine, or British tea. With a spoon, misery, not to mention the improvisation. Soldiers across continents came up with novel ways to make their meals a little less awful, such as helmet-lid stews and coffee made with muck and bravery. Field kitchens used the ingenuity of weary brains to stretch resources. The soldiers learnt to cook with anything that didn't blow up. Food was important, even amid famine and in captivity. Culture was what it meant. At home. Identity. You were tossed into a hole and given a spoon by the tiny flame of your pre-war self. Because a hot lunch, even one composed of cabbage, fat, and dread, was a reminder in a world where everything was crumbling. You still hadn't given up. Trepanation, the audacious, almost mad art of drilling, scraping, or making a hole in someone's head existed long before scalpels, anesthesia, or even the idea of germ theory. Although it sounds like something you might find in a torture cell from the Middle Ages, it actually existed before civilization. Trepanned skulls from over 7,000 years ago have been discovered by archaeologists all throughout the world, from the plains of Ukraine to the mountains of Peru. Humanity apparently tried neurosurgery for the first time by smashing open someone's head. Here's the real kicker, though. A few of these individuals made it out alive, not a single one or two. Healed bone surrounding the hole in certain ancient burials indicates that the patients lived long enough for their heads to begin growing back, proving that they were real medical treatments rather than botched murders. Thus, we are left with an unsettling reality. Somebody somewhere thought, what if we just open the skull and let the evil spirits out? When they saw a seizure, a headache, or a mental breakdown. And that's precisely what they thought. Tumors and bacteria were not the focus of early medicine. It had to do with imbalance, spirits, and curses. Trepanation was not considered dangerous, it was healing. Do you have a headache? Do a drill. Mood fluctuations? Do a drill. War-related injuries? Do a drill. A failed marriage? Well, probably not that. You get the concept, though. Let's say that the tools were rustic. Perfectly round apertures were made with obsidian knives, flint scrapers, and later bronze tools. It is thought that occasionally the sufferer was conscious and restrained by supportive family members or acquaintances. Not an anesthetic, naturally. Just determination, adrenaline, and, if you were lucky, fermented berry juice. The accuracy is what's amazing. Some first-year medical students could not handle the pristine, symmetrical holes found in some skulls. Despite not having access to contemporary knowledge, these early surgeons had established reliable methods that were handed down through the centuries. Furthermore, their practical talent with a chisel and some nerve was indisputable, even though their knowledge of the brain was only as advanced as astrology. The Egyptians were the first ancient society to approach surgery with a startling blend of superstition and science. Not only were these morticians clothed in linen skilled at keeping the dead alive, but they were also adept at healing the living. We know that the Egyptians had protocols for fractures, dislocations, abscesses, and even spinal injuries because of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old surgical document that reads like a war medic's journal. With the exception of the section where every ailment results in death, it's essentially the antiquated version of WebMD. Under the watchful eye of their gods, particularly Imhotep, the architect turned physician turned deity, Egyptian surgeons performed their operations. Your doctor might mumble a few prayers, check the stars, and then grab his obsidian scalpel if your shoulder was dislocated or your skull fractured. Surgery was a spiritual battle against illness and demonic spirits, not just a medical procedure. They had surprisingly advanced tools, bone saws, cauterizing irons, hooks, forceps, and bronze scalpels. They were used with care, even if they weren't sterilized, unless burning incense over them counts. Using splints fashioned from reeds and linen soaked with resin, the Egyptians were able to repair fractures, drain abscesses, and sew wounds. And honey, the star of the ancient Egyptian medicinal cabinet, came into play when it came to infection. Honey was applied topically to wounds to keep them clean and encourage healing since it was antibacterial, sticky, and unexpectedly effective. In fact, it was so successful that its value has been validated by contemporary science. But the Egyptians had their limits too. Can you imagine surviving a crocodile bite only to be treated with the same item you put in your tea? Anything that had to do with the stomach or the brain made them nervous. Your chances were poor if you had a brain tumor or stomach ulcer, since inside organs were regarded as divine and forbidden. Unless, of course, your ailment was one that could be cured by a specially placed amulet, a chant, or a poultice. Nevertheless, Egypt provided us with one of the earliest medical systems that attempted to distinguish between treatment and pure speculation. Their approach to surgery was meticulous, well-planned, and remarkably sophisticated for a society that mummified cats, even if the diagnosis occasionally included a curse or two. In case you were wondering, the same individuals who constructed the pyramids were also capable of expertly removing a splinter. A guy named Sushruta was a skillful and systematic physician in ancient India who practiced surgery long before modern hospitals and clean gloves. He is frequently referred to be the father of surgery. Furthermore, this isn't just another title that we throw around. The book on surgery was literally written by this man. This Sanskrit medical literature, known as the Sushruta Samhita, was composed circa 600 BCE and detailed more than 300 surgical operations, 120 tools, and methods that would have made the typical medieval barber surgeon faint. Back-alley butchering was not Sushruta's style. Amputations, bone realignment, hernia repairs, cataract removals, and even cosmetic surgery were among the intricate procedures he executed with extraordinary skill. Indeed, the first known rhinoplasty was performed in India. Sushruta could make you a new nose out of skin from your forehead or cheek if yours was cut off, which wasn't all that uncommon at the time due to the criminal justice system. A stiff upper lip and some herbal wine to ease the pain. No anesthesia, of course. Ayurveda, a holistic medical system that balanced body, mind, and spirit, was closely related to surgery in ancient India. Surgery was performed with remarkable technical skill, even though it was viewed as a last choice, best followed by medicines, massages, prayers, and occasionally cow urine therapy. Alcohol was used to disinfect wounds, plant fibers were used to stitch them, and antimicrobial herbs were used to treat them. Additionally, Indian surgeons understood the importance of sanitation, unlike their European counterparts centuries later. The training was tough and hands-on. To mimic the feel of human tissue, students practiced making incisions on dead animals, vegetables, leather, and even water-filled bladders. They had to demonstrate their steadiness before they could touch a genuine patient. Because you don't have another chance once you start using a bronze scalpel to cut someone. Ayurvedic literature also placed a strong emphasis on moral behavior, such as giving the impoverished free treatment and obtaining informed permission. It was about moral obligation as much as it was about healing disease. Ancient Indian surgery stood out for its methodical, factual approach in a society where medicine frequently tended toward the mystical. Don't believe that the Greeks were only interested in disputing about the essence of reality and creating democracy. They experimented with surgery as well. Surgery is uncomfortable, painful, and frequently frightening. Ancient Greek medicine was a jumbled synthesis of gut instinct, superstition, and philosophy. Literal guts, sometimes displayed in a little healer's room or on the battlefield. Hippocrates, who is frequently referred to as the father of medicine, was at the center of it all. He famously distinguished between illness and divine retribution and attempted to treat patients using reason and observation. Revolutionary material. Until you discover that the majority of surgeries still entailed making incisions while the patient cried. Hippocrates himself was not a fan of intricate operations, although he was well versed in abscess drainage, fractures, dislocations, and the always entertaining practice of bloodletting. Opening a vein and crossing your fingers is the epitome of healing. However, when Galen entered the picture in the 2nd century CE, things truly got out of hand. Galen was a Greek doctor in Rome who was fascinated with anatomy but was not permitted to dissect people. He therefore used pigs, monkeys, and the occasional gladiator for practice, just like any adventurous scientist of the day. He conducted animal vivisections and developed intricate anatomical hypotheses, some of which were outrageously inaccurate, but astounding for someone making a guess without cadavers or Google. Greek surgical instruments were remarkably sophisticated: hooks, bone saws, catheters, forceps, and scalpels. To halt bleeding, the Greeks even employed cauterization, which involves sealing a cut with hot metal. And even if that sounds archaic, it was effective. It hurts, but it works. Imagine it as old-fashioned laser surgery, only you're awake and the laser is a glowing hot iron bar. The actual practice areas were battlefields. In real time, with no room for error and no morphine, Greek doctors learned how to treat head injuries, crushed limbs, and arrow wounds. You might just live if you were able to survive a spear wound to the gut, and your surgeon wasn't fainted by the sight of intestines. The four humours, a charmingly non-scientific notion that your health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, remained the foundation of Greek surgery despite all its instruments and theories. Thus, an overzealous leech therapy could kill you even if your operation didn't. The Romans had a reputation for being blunt, and this also applied to surgery. The Romans provided us with emergency trauma care and field hospitals, while the Greeks provided us with theory and ethics. You get quite skilled at reassembling bodies very quickly when your empire spans continents, and your favorite hobby is stabbing people in arenas. The medicus, Rome's equivalent of the battlefield surgeon, was at the heart of this blood-soaked invention. These resilient doctors worked from mobile clinics known as valetudinaria that were positioned close to military camps while they were stationed with legions. These weren't cozy places, filled with injured warriors, clanging implements, and the stench of sweat and iron. These were tents of agony. Roman surgeons were skilled in wound closure, cauterization, amputations, shattered bone mending, trauma care, and arrow extraction. The medicus had an answer if your arm was hanging by a thread. It usually involved boiling water and hoping your heart could handle it. Anesthesia? Not at all. If you were fortunate, you were given either opium or wine. You were held down if you were unlucky. But they weren't making things up as they went along. From eye surgeries to hemorrhoidectomies, Roman medical literature, such as those of Celsus, described exacting techniques. Ever the charmer, Celsus gave a frighteningly cheerful explanation of how to lance an abscess, make a cut that is long enough to accommodate a finger. How lyrical! In contrast, their equipment wouldn't be out of place in a contemporary emergency room. They had bone drills, hooks, retractors, forceps, scalpels, and catheters. Many were carefully carved and fashioned of iron or bronze. Since the Romans valued good engineering more than capturing Gaul, some of them even had movable screws. Roman medicine was surprisingly methodical in spite of all this bloodshed. Injuries were bandaged, cleaned, often with vinegar, and observed. Even though they were unaware of the cause, they recognized the risk of infection. They also practiced separating the savable from the dying, which was remarkably similar to triage. However, their comprehension was limited. Seldom were attempts at internal surgery made. Good luck was usually the prognosis if your guts were visible. However, Roman surgeons rescued lives for exterior wounds, particularly during combat, on a scale never seen in antiquity. Ancient Chinese medicine was a masterclass in striking a balance between body and spirit, yin and yang, and, above all, between chopping someone up and perhaps only administering acupuncture. Surgery was performed with extreme caution, despite the fact that Chinese culture created one of the most sophisticated medical systems in antiquity. The body was revered and regarded as a gift from one's forefathers. It was not taken lightly, therefore, to poke around inside it. However, Chinese surgeons shone a startling level of inventiveness when surgery was necessary, such as in cases of severe abscesses, malignancies, or injuries. Documents dating back to the Zhou dynasty c. surgical operations, including as wound care and even organ removal, are mentioned in texts from 1000 BCE. Additionally, practitioners such as Hua Tuo had achieved legendary status by the Han dynasty. Huatuo was not merely a fortunate herbalist, he was a trailblazer. He removed tumors, operated on the abdomen, and even administered anesthesia. Take a moment to process that. Huatuo developed an anesthetic concoction called Ma Fei San, which was produced from wine, and powdered herbs like datura, while most of the ancient world just gave patients a stick to bite down on. In essence, it was old-fashioned knockout juice, and it was said to be effective. His most well-known operation, successfully removing diseased tissue from a warlord's abdomen and suturing him back together. However, as is customary with innovative geniuses, a suspicious emperor later put Huatuo to death because he believed he was planning a sorcery, excellent for science but detrimental to job security. Bronze knives, cauterization irons, hooks and needles were among the surgical implements used in China. Several of these items resembled contemporary ones. However, the ideology frequently discouraged invasive therapy, even while the instruments were available. Instead of renegade organs or tainted blood, ancient Chinese medicine, TCM, believed that illness resulted from an imbalance in the body's energy lines, or meridians. Therefore, acupuncture, massage, cupping, herbal therapy, or surgery was frequently the last option. Nevertheless, the Huangdi Neijing and other Chinese medical writings demonstrate a remarkable grasp of anatomy and injury care. Even while they didn't dissect bodies like the Greeks or repair legions like the Romans, they functioned with a startling level of complexity, purpose, and accuracy. Surgery was more than just a medical operation in the Maya, Aztec, and Inca cities of antiquity. It was frequently intertwined with ritual, conflict, and basic survival. Despite being most famous for their stepped pyramids and human sacrifice, these civilizations had considerably more sophisticated surgical skills than most people realize, particularly in the areas of bone healing, wound treatment, and cranial alteration. Let's begin with obsidian blades, which are their preferred surgical instrument. Compared to contemporary steel, obsidian scalpels were sharper, sterile when first broken, and able to cut at the molecular level. Because of how cleanly they cut flesh, several contemporary surgeons have actually experimented using obsidian blades. The drawback? They break. Not quite OSHA approved then. Trepanation was especially well known among the Incas, who lived high in the Andes. More skull drilling indeed. According to archaeological evidence, Inca doctors carried out hundreds or even thousands of these operations to cure head injuries that were probably brought on by clubs or sling stones during combat. Remarkably, some patients managed to survive not just one trepanation, but several. The fact that their recovery rates were frequently higher than those of 19th century Europe illustrates how terrible that era was. In contrast, the Aztecs possessed an extensive arsenal of plant-based anesthetics. Given how frequently limbs had to be amputated owing to infection, freezing, or punishment, they likely utilized herbs like tolox, a kind of detourer, to reduce pain and promote sleep. Urine or chili pepper infusions were used to clean wounds, which was an antibacterial and memorable tactic. Tlacoponim, healers, and surgeons, who were frequently taught from an early age, guarded and transmitted medical information with great care. They used fibers from maguey cactus to suture wounds, treated abscesses, and even used reed or wood splints to repair fractures. They tried to carefully clean and seal wounds since they knew that infection may be fatal. However, the distinction between ceremonial and medicine was blurred, as was the case in many ancient societies. Surgery may be performed as a ritual or as a means of healing. Cutting into flesh was sometimes done to placate gods or read omens rather than to save lives. The Islamic Golden Age was the only period in history when surgery received a true advancement. Scholars in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were translating, conserving, and transforming old medical knowledge between the 8th and 13th centuries, while the majority of Europe was occupied with praying and using leeches to bleed patients. And nowhere was this combination of knowledge and skill more evident than in the development of Persian and Arab surgery. Al-Zarawi, whose Latin name is Abul Qarsis, was a physician from Al-Andalus, present-day Spain, who lived in the 10th century. His impact would be remembered for generations in medical textbooks. The Kitab al-Tasrif, his colossal effort, was more than just a medical manual. The last volume of the 30-volume encyclopedia was devoted solely to surgery. The man demonstrated the tools rather than merely listing them. More than 200 surgical tools, including forceps, scalpels, and catheters, many of which are remarkably similar to those seen in a contemporary operating room. Al-Zarawi explained how to treat fractures, dissections, cauterizations, and even dental work and caesarean sections. In an era when post-operative care was typically associated with good fortune and not bleeding on the floor, his emphasis on accuracy, cleanliness, and patient aftercare was groundbreaking. His art caught on like wildfire. It was translated into Latin and used for more than 500 years as a standard surgical reference throughout Europe. This was accepted medical wisdom, not esoteric information. Even though he tended more toward internal medicine and diagnosis, Persian polymaths like Avicenna and Ibn Sina made significant contributions to surgical philosophy. Many contemporary surgeons could still heed his medical canon, which prescribed when and how surgery should be performed and cautioned against performing surgery when less complex solutions would be adequate. Islamic surgery was unique because it balanced ethics, science, and documentation. Surgery was a craft refined by experimentation, argument, and observation, rather than merely a hunch or superstition. Medical students trained alongside experts at hospitals in Bimuristans, which frequently housed lecture halls and libraries. They read Greek and Indian medical classics, dissected animals, and sharpened their brains and blades. What remains when the obsidian has broken, the scalpels have dulled, and the trepanation holes have either healed or not. A legacy etched into the very fabric of history, strange, brilliant, and occasionally terrifying. In addition to bravery and pain tolerance, ancient surgery involved trial and error, as well as unrelenting human curiosity. One theme shows up across geographies and cultures. Whether it was an Inca warrior's fractured skull, an Egyptian farmer's abscess, or a Roman legionary's gashed leg, people have always been willing to risk suffering and death to mend what's broken. Ancient surgeons filled in where gods, prayers, and herbs had failed, and frequently, against all odds, they were successful. Not anything held up well over time. The four humours, lost. A diagnosis of evil spirits, retired. As an antiseptic, urine, hard pass. However, a lot of their concepts are still relevant in contemporary medicine. Reconstructive plastic surgery was founded on the Indian rhinoplasty. Emergency treatment procedures were developed from Roman combat triage. Chinese anesthesia, a spiritual forerunner of contemporary sedation. Even the Qatari instruments used in Islamic hospitals bear a striking resemblance to modern surgical kit equipment. Ancient surgery is remarkable because of its inventiveness as much as its gore. Despite lacking access to anesthesia, knowledge of microorganisms and microscopes, these early practitioners were able to improvise, often wonderfully. They made metal instruments that wouldn't seem out of place in a drawer from the 19th century, honed stones into scalpels, and employed wine and plants as pain relievers. It's also important to note how surgical choices were influenced by cultural environment. Surgery was a respected profession in some regions, such as India and Persia, where it was supported by formal training and ethical standards. In others, it was an act of desperation saved for ritual or need on the battlefield. While bodily mending was important to certain cultures, spiritual harmony was to others. While some prayed, others prodded, many did both. Every successful procedure, however, was preceded by a terrible gamble. No numbing agents, no antibiotics, only hope and perhaps a few chants. We must first meet the Illyrians, the people beneath the ink, before delving into spirals, sunbursts, and warriors with eagle wings. a mosaic of ferocious tribal peoples dispersed throughout the Western Balkans, from the Adriatic Sea to the Dinaric Alps, rather than a single, cohesive nation. Their territories now include parts of Croatia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Albania, Montenegro, and more. For generations the Romans feared them, the Greeks knew them, and they were almost allergic to centralized power. The Illyrians were not creating marble cities or writing epic poetry. They were constructing hill forts that looked down on anyone stupid enough to invade, forging swords and plundering neighbors. Due in large part to the Illyrians' propensity to disregard tactful diplomacy and go right for the throat, the Greeks referred to them as barbarians. Despite their image, they had a very rich cultural identity that was expressed through tattoos, paintings, and carvings on their bodies rather than on scrolls. Each of these close-knit tribal communities had its own chieftain, traditions, and frequently unique symbolic languages. These were not ornamental symbols. They held significance, memory, and power. Body art was not considered fashionable by the Illyrians. It served a purpose and was closely related to rituals, military rank, tribal identification, and possibly even spirituality. We can learn about their world from archaeological discoveries like the Tepes Hill necropolises and the Glasinac burial mounds. Spiral-patterned earthenware, metal plates with images of raptors, and jewelry carved with sun themes. Ancient writers fill in the blanks, even though the skin doesn't survive the ages. The usage of tattoos by the Illyrians is mentioned by Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and other Roman and Greek authors, sometimes with a mixture of dread and admiration. Of course, they weren't the only ones playing the ink game. Tattooing was common among the Scythians, Thracians, Celts, and other ancient warrior societies. However, the Illyrians were among the few who accepted it, incorporating it into feminine decoration, warrior pride, and rites of passage. You can't merely observe what Illyrians wore to really comprehend their body art. Eagle feathers for bravery, sun wheels to honor their gods, and holy spirals repeating life, death, and the never-ending cycle of conflict and rebirth. You have to imagine what they carried on their flesh. They were an active people, the Illyrians. Their history is inscribed on bone, bronze, and skin rather than paper. Symbols become everything when your history is etched into the hillsides and your alphabet is oral. Despite not creating epic sagas, the Illyrians were masters of visual language, infusing their weaponry, jewelry, body art, and ceremonial objects with potent meanings. For them, a spiral was the essential blueprint of life, not just a beautiful shape. First, let's talk about the spiral. The spiral was one of the most common motifs appearing engraved onto pottery, carved into stone slabs, and deduced from artwork found in Illyrian tombs. What does it mean? Most likely associated with cycles, birth, death, rebirth, and perhaps the eternal rising and falling of the sun. This was a reassuring, rebellious sign for a military civilization that lived fiercely and died young. Life always comes back, your bloodline, if not you. The sun disk, another common motif, comes next. The Illyrians worshipped the sun, or at least were aware of it. The solar wheel, which was frequently enclosed by dots or radial lines, stood for strength, masculinity, and divine favor. Even though he didn't have six-pack abs, a man with a sun symbol inscribed on his chest was radiating cosmic strength. Predatory birds and eagles were also common. These sparrows were not adorable, rather they represented aristocracy, conflict, and the divine bond between the sky and the earth. Eagle standards were even carried into battle by some Illyrian tribes, such as the RDA, according to Roman records. A man of rank, or at least someone not to mess with, was indicated by an eagle tattoo which was probably drawn in sharp geometric lines. Artifacts also frequently featured geometric patterns, zigzags, triangles, and wave-like designs, all of which were probably reflected in tattoos. These weren't arbitrary. Triangle clusters would have stood for fertility or ancestry, while zigzags might have symbolized water or lightning. In the same way that a man's tattoo may commemorate violence or heavenly favor, a woman's might honor childbirth or tribal allegiance. The striking thing is that the symbols were both diverse and cohesive. While some were personal totems or spiritual sigils, others were obviously tribal markings. Every design was a statement, your identity, your convictions, and your desired legacy. For the Illyrians, identity was represented by symbols. You become them, rather than merely wearing them. As though to declare, this is me and this is forever, they were inscribed into the skin. The instruments of the Illyrians' craft still whisper secrets through archaeology, despite the fact that they left no instruction manuals behind. And in terms of body art, that whisper entails a great deal of pain, ash, and needles. Like most ancient customs, tattooing in Illyria was most likely done by hand. That meant just pointed bronze or bone needles, crude pigment, a very steady hand, and no buzzing machinery or sterile gloves. Delicate metal pins, which are sometimes mistaken for stitching or fibulae, but may have also been used as tattooing tools, are among the best examples of Illyrian artistry. And you haven't encountered the Illyrians if you believe it's unrealistic to picture a warrior priest using a bronze pin to dab ash into someone's exposed flesh. To make a sticky, ink-like paste, the pigment, likely a mixture of charcoal, soot, and perhaps crushed herbs, was mixed with animal fat or oil. This had ceremonial importance in addition to being done to complete the task. Some tribes may have transformed tattoos into movable talismans by using sacred ashes from ceremonial fires or burned totems. The procedure probably entailed cutting or puncturing the skin, applying the pigment, and letting it heal if an infection hadn't already reached it. Because of their strong ties to nature and early folk medicine, the Illyrians were familiar with the use of honey, animal fat, and herbal salves for healing. However, these tattoos weren't applied carelessly. They were probably used at rituals or rites of passage, times of metamorphosis, when a girl got married, when a lad killed his first victim, or when a warrior advanced in rank. It's possible that some tattoos were even won via hardships. Once the ink sealed the scar, it became sacrosanct. Not everyone experienced pain, but it was a necessary element of the purpose and not a side effect. Elites, warriors, and people in spiritual positions might have been the only ones with tattoos, a sort of inked nobility. Or, like tartans or totems in other ancient societies, it might have been widely utilized in some tribes to identify clans or familial lineages. The Illyrians considered battle to be a way of life rather than merely an occasional annoyance. Tribes battled for territory, honor, retribution, and occasionally just because it was Tuesday. Warriors weren't just any old people in this harsh environment. They were proudly, permanently, and plainly marked. Tattoos served as announcements rather than embellishments. Picture a tanned and scarred warrior standing naked on a rocky mountaintop with the outline of an eagle wing or sunwheel spread across his chest. That was identity made flesh, not vanity ink. It informed his adversaries of his origins, his experiences, and his potential for combat. If there was no written language in the world, your skin served as your resume. Numerous Illyrian tribes had tattoos on their bodies as rites of passage into warriorhood, not merely for aesthetic reasons, according to Roman writers like Pliny the Elder. A first combat survived could be symbolized with a spiral engraved on the arm. The back of an eagle, evidence of a warrior advancing through the ranks of the tribe. Similar to live medals, tattoos bled when you moved rather than hanging on a wall. Evidence suggests that some designs were clan-specific, identifying the tribe or lineage of a warrior. This was a pragmatic move rather than merely a cultural ploy. Being able to tell friend from foe was crucial on a chaotic battlefield, and following the conflict. A tattoo could explain why a body didn't make it home or help return it to its people. These tattoos were also strategically placed. Arms and hands for martial accomplishments, chest and shoulders for rank. The back may feature images of thunderbirds or sun discs which would invoke the protection of the gods of heaven. Indeed, some Illyrian warriors probably had facial tattoos to honor the gods or frighten off adversaries. Imagine facing a person who has lightning bolts engraved into their cheekbones. You would reconsider. It wasn't all glory, though. Additionally, tattoos conveyed tales of penance or retribution. A modest, permanent, and unmistakable mark of shame could be permanently inked on a warrior who has been disgraced. Ink had the power to either uplift you or remind you of your failures each time you glanced in the mirror in that culture. It's natural to imagine grizzled warriors with eagle talons and spirals inscribed on their bodies when we think of ancient tattoos. However, women also wore their stories on their skins among the Illyrians. Furthermore, they had more than simply decorative tattoos. They were profoundly symbolic, social, and spiritual. For girls, getting a tattoo was a rite of passage in some Illyrian tribes, particularly around puberty or marriage. These were not ornamental flourishes or haphazard designs. Each line of these holy marks, which were handed down through the centuries, told a tale of power, role, and ancestry. Additionally, archaeological discoveries such as bronze mirror cases, spindle whorls, and jewelry engraved with wavy lines, sunbursts, and repeating triangles are examples of mirror patterns that experts believe were originally inked onto women's faces, arms, and legs. The triangle was a popular motif that was frequently arranged in designs that probably symbolized femininity, fertility, and the divine cycle of life. By warding off ghosts and calling out the blessings of the tribal deities, the goddesses of earth, moon, and water, some people think these tattoos functioned as protective symbols during childbirth. It's possible that women from specific tribes in Illyria also frequently had face tattoos. Rebellion was not indicated by little marks across the brow, on the chin, or close to the eyes. They served as status, beauty, or ethnic pride badges. The remarkably marked women of the Balkans were sometimes referenced by Roman writers who were usually perplexed by or contemptuous of barbarian practices. Their ink was described as strange, wild, or tribal mysticism. However, tattoos weren't solely for aesthetics or customs. They could represent loss, devotion, or retaliation. Some may have ink that symbolizes blood-stained vows, while widows may have tattoos of a broken sun or coiled spiral as a sign of their grief. In a society where oral memory was valued more highly than written records, the skin turned into a scroll of unspoken pronouncements. And the privileged weren't the only ones. According to some evidence, common women, particularly those from hill tribes, had simpler tattoos that might have been symbols of local deities or family loyalty. Priestesses or spiritual healers, on the other hand, might have had even more intricate plans, channeling heavenly power via their bodies as living talismans. The Illyrians viewed tattooing as profoundly spiritual, not only cosmetic or social. Every mark on the body had the power to channel heavenly energy in a world where gods resided in thunder, rivers, and mountains. The body was the altar, and ink was a rite. We know that the Illyrians worshipped a variety of nature deities, solar gods, and tribe spirits, and their tattoos reflected this animistic worldview, even though much of their religion has been reconstructed from fragments, burial mounds, grave goods, and second-hand Roman descriptions. Birds might have stood for the soul in flight, while spirals would have represented eternity and the universe. Getting a tattoo was a way to align yourself with cosmic forces, not just a fashion statement. According to many academics, tattoos were given during initiation ceremonies or seasonal celebrations that were supervised by tribal priestesses or shamans. These were no private, peaceful times. They were open gatherings that occasionally included chanting, drumming, and ceremonial suffering. Bleeding was considered a component of the sacrifice. The human and the divine were connected by pain. It's possible that some symbols were exclusive to people who had received spiritual instruction. For example, a healer may wear a sequence of protective bands down their arm to fend off evil spirits, or they may bear a mark of the earth goddess. Before going to fight, warriors could be given holy symbols as visual declarations of their allegiance to the gods, as well as magical armor and morale boosts. There is also conjecture that burial customs involved tattoos, mirrors, sun discs, bird effigies, and other symbolic items are frequently found near bodies found in Illyrian necropolises. A matching ink, intended to direct the departed into the afterlife or indicate their position to the ancestors, might have been visible if the skin had survived. Only those with tattoos are thought to be able to enter the world of spirits unopposed in certain tribes. The others were merely phantoms. It's possible that the tattooing supplies had ritual significance as well. In addition to being antibacterial, ashes from holy fires or pigments combined with herbs consecrated under a full moon had a spiritual charge. It was quite difficult to distinguish between magic, medicine, and art. A tattoo may reveal your identity to everyone, something that no passport or scroll could ever do among the Illyrians. Your status, rank, and heredity were frequently inscribed directly on your skin in a tribal society where devotion was more important than following the law. The warriors, chiefs, and relatives of each Illyrian tribe were identified by their own visual culture, symbols, patterns, and motifs. One clan may have a zigzag-lined mountain sign, while another may have a curved sun image. In a divided, war-torn area, these tattoos served as tribal signatures and visual shorthand for identity, in addition to being personal. Tattoos could be used as badges of power for tribal champions, chieftains, aristocrats, and the privileged. A man who was inked with multi-layer spirals, sunbursts, and eagle talons wasn't merely flaunting himself. He was telling everyone he encountered about his accomplishments, lineage, and social standing. These distinctive, meaningful, and easily recognizable marks served as heraldic shields. High-status women would have adorned their forearms or collarbones with more elaborate tattoos that represented fertility, divine favor, or aristocratic ancestry, such as rows of motifs or mirrored shapes. A woman's affiliation with a priestess class, tribe oracle, or healer lineage was probably indicated by some of the themes. Warriors weren't the only ones with status. Strong evidence also points to the existence of kinship tattoos, which are straightforward symbols used by families to signify kinship. Imagine it like an old-fashioned surname, only permanent, recognizable, and mythical. It told people, "I am of this blood," which might either save you or mark you for retribution in combat or in life. Position was important. Warriors used their upper arms and chests as ideal real estate to display their power and accomplishments. Those of social or religious significance were the only ones allowed to get facial tattoos, which were never worn casually, but rather with pride. A hand symbol could indicate that the person is a sworn protector of this clan. Perhaps a reminder of a personal oath or a protector role might be shown by a mark on the back. Regardless of how borders changed, these emblems acted as cultural anchors and a constant reminder of one's origins as tribes clashed, united, or disbanded. The ink on your body may speak louder than words in a society where survival and battle were frequent tests of identity. The Romans brought a completely different worldview with them when they invaded Illyrian country, in addition to using troops to conquer. Illyrian body painting appeared to the Romans as a hybrid of tribal witchcraft and savage ritual. The Romans responded with a mixture of contempt, terror, and reluctant fascination, as they did with most things they didn't comprehend, Strabo and Pliny the Elder, two Roman writers, characterize Illyrians as tattooed barbarians with unusual designs on their skin that identify them as primitive. Coming from a society that enjoyed public executions and enjoyed wearing wolf pelts, this was obviously rich. Nevertheless, Illyrian tattoos ended up being one of the distinguishing visual markers of these individuals, and not in a positive sense. Body art was considered disgraceful by Roman aristocracy. In their civilization, tattoos were not connected to warriors or nobles, but rather to criminals, slaves, and soldiers. Thus, tattooing was among the first cultural losses when the empire seized Illyrian lands. It was controlled, discouraged, and in certain situations, downright prohibited. Erasure, however, was never that easy. Local practices, including tattoos, were occasionally adopted by Roman soldiers stationed in the Balkans. Although Illyrian auxiliary soldiers in the Roman army may have exchanged their customary clothing for a Roman lyrica, there is evidence that they retained their tribal marks, and the symbols on their skin suggested a distinct kind of allegiance. Long after Rome attempted to eradicate them, Illyrian women most likely carried on the custom in private, transferring meanings and symbolism. After all, cultural memory is obstinate, and tattoos, particularly the handcrafted, covert ones, are even more so. Ironically, a modified form of Illyrian body art spread along with Roman influence. Though more subtly, certain Romanized Balkan communities still used tattooing as a means of identifying with their tribe or religion. The impulse to mark the flesh with identity and story may have diminished, but the original meanings remained. What started out as a holy proclamation gradually turned into a battlefield of cultures. Under Roman scrutiny, tattoos disappeared, although they were never completely forgotten. Even decades later, Illyrian designs resurfaced in family themes, ceremonial garments, and folk embroidery passed down from one generation to the next and from flesh to fabric. The Illyrian tribes were subjugated, assimilated, and dispersed, but their ink remained. It moved, changed, and reverberated throughout centuries, leaving the Balkans with faint traces that persist to this day. Although Illyrians are no longer seen on the streets, their insignia can still be seen in tattoos, traditional jewelry, stone sculptures, and Albanian ethnic costumes. Indeed, contemporary tattoo artists in Albania, Kosovo, and Bosnia have started to proudly reinvent and reclaim historical Illyrian motifs, such as spirals, eagles, suns, and geometric bands, as a part of their cultural identities. Women's face tattoos continued long into the 20th century in some rural areas of Albania. These tattoos, which were passed down orally, were often faint and worn with time. They were little spirals, stars, or crosses. The meaning was rarely ornamental to the ladies who carried them. As they had been for thousands of years, they were tribal, ancestral, and protecting. Illyrian motifs have found their way into contemporary state iconography, even outside of tattoos. Flying with pride on the Albanian flag, the double-headed eagle reflects old Illyrian imagery of predatory birds as representations of power, vision, and divine authority. Although historians disagree as to whether the eagle sign originated in Illyria or via Byzantine heraldry, many Albanians consider it to be a direct cultural legacy. Illyrian imagery has become something of a subcultural rebirth in modern culture, particularly among Balkan youth, who are looking for origins outside of Ottoman legacies and Roman ruins. Illyrian designs are cited by academics, artists, and musicians in digital art, fashion, murals, and album covers. Not as a costume, but as a form of reclamation. What was once lost in burial mounds is now inked on chests and reproduced on T-shirts. There is also a renewed interest among academics. While linguists attempt to trace Illyrian names and words in regional dialects, archaeologists and historians continue to find items with distinct body art motifs. Additionally, biological ties to Illyrian populations are being investigated as DNA technology develops, giving ancient ink new meaning. Therefore, it is evident that the Illyrian custom of marking the body as a declaration of identity, honor, and belonging never really vanished, even though the original connotations may have been obscured by centuries of conquest, repression, and cultural drift. It was just waiting for the following generation to pay attention, and when they did, they wrote it in ink, just like their ancestors did, rather than in books. Hernán Cortés was born in the Kingdom of Castile in the little town of Medellín in 1485. He had no territory, no army, and no royal title when he was born. All he had was desire and a talent for defying authority. He was a skinny, agitated child who was sent to the University of Salamanca to study law. There he studied just enough legal theory and Latin to get disinterested and leave school. After all, Spain was full of stories about native empires, new continents, and unfathomable wealth on the other side of the Atlantic. If you could steal an empire, why read dusty law scrolls? At the age of 19, Cortés sailed to the New World in 1504, arriving at the Spanish Caribbean port of Hispaniola. He assimilated into colonial culture swiftly, acquiring land, controlling slave labor, and earning political influence. He accompanied Diego Velázquez on the bloody conquest of Cuba in 1511, when he gained notoriety for his bravery, slyness, and risky propensity to disobey orders. He received wealth and power as a reward, but he still desired much more. Rumors of a huge Western empire, wealthy towns, feathered soldiers, and gold heaped high like logs began to circulate by 1518. Reluctantly, Velázquez, who is now the ruler of Cuba, assigned Cortés to head an expedition to investigate and trade along the Mexican coast. However, when Cortés was getting his ships ready, Velázquez changed his mind and withdrew the order. Typical of Cortés, he chose to ignore him. With 11 ships, 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and an excessive quantity of ambition and gunpowder, he set off in February 1519. Cortés had no interest in exchanging beads for coconuts from the beginning. He had a plan and desired conquest, a combination of brutal violence, religious zeal, duplicity, and diplomacy. His objective, in the hierarchy of the Spanish crown, it was not only gold but also glory and a title. In armor, the man was anything but a brute. Being a skilled manipulator, he could one day win over the local chiefs and the next set their cities on fire. In contrast to many of his contemporaries, Cortés viewed the native civilizations as systems that could be subverted, manipulated, and used against them rather than as barriers. Hernán Cortés had already begun to fantasize about rulers, pyramids, and loot by the time he set foot on the Yucatan Peninsula. Exploration has come to an end. With Cortés leading the charge, the age of conquest had begun. There was little ceremony to welcome Hernán Cortés to the Yucatan Peninsula in early 1519. Arrows were hurled at him. The arrival of more pale men with steel and horses did not exactly excite the Maya, who were seasoned warriors and survivors of earlier Spanish attacks. The initial interactions swiftly became violent. Battles between Spanish weapons and spears tipped with obsidian took place in the oppressive humidity. However, Cortés gained something considerably more important than riches from these battles: details. He quickly discovered that a mystery ruler named Moctezuma, sitting atop a pile of riches in a metropolis bigger than any Spain had ever seen, governed a huge kingdom to the west. Everything, the Aztecs, the empire, the prize. Cortés also gained two important advantages from these early clashes. Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Spanish castaway who had lived in Maya land for years and was now fluent in the local languages, was the first. The second, and far more significant, was a young lady called Malintzin, or La Malinche, as she is known to the Spanish. She was a talented linguist and astute observer who was able to decipher the Aztec language, Nahuatl. She soon became Cortés's consort, counselor, and interpreter. She gave Cortés strength in addition to words. Equipped with these language instruments, Cortés started his actual conquest using strategy rather than swords. He came to the Totonacs, a tribe subjugated by Aztec tribute demands, as he continued along the coast. The Totonacs provided men, food, and local knowledge in exchange for Cortés's protection when he saw an opening. It was the first of several native coalitions that would play a key role in his campaign. Cortés then made the most spectacular gesture of his career in an act of irrevocable intent. He sank, torched, and scuttled his ships. Regardless of the rendition, the message was unmistakable. There was no going back. His guys would either succeed or fail. Now the Spanish were land-bound conquerors on a foreign continent, encircled by immense empires, unknown adversaries, and unknown illnesses. But Cortés had something his enemies lacked, a mind that played war like chess, a drive for glory, and a fractured political landscape that he could control. Tenochtitlan would not be the beginning of the Aztec Empire's conquest. Here, in the Yucatan jungles, it began with blood, alliances, and a translator who would determine the destiny of entire continents. Hernán Cortés turned inland toward the legendary city of Tenochtitlan, the pulsating heart of the Aztec Empire, his ships shattered and his soldiers dedicated. However, getting there was more than just marching. It was a master class in deceit, violence, and manipulation. The Tlaxcalans, ferocious mountain warriors who had fought against Aztec domination for many generations, presented him with his first significant challenge and chance. They initially engaged the Spanish in full-scale combat with spears and slings. The combat was vicious. The Tlaxcalans resisted breaking even though Cortés's cavalry and muskets wreaked mayhem. The Spanish were virtually overpowered, outnumbered, and worn out. Abruptly, Cortés extended an offer of peace to them, a chance for retribution and peace. The Tlaxcalans agreed since they saw Cortés as a weapon to use against their Aztec masters. They detested Moctezuma more than they detested him. Cortés received something from the blood-stained alliance that Spain could never have given him: thousands of native warriors who were familiar with the Aztec culture, politics, and terrain. Cortés proceeded to Cholula, a prosperous city and a religious hub, with Tlaxcalan assistance. However, something went wrong. Cortés ordered a massacre regardless of whether it was a prearranged ambush or a misinterpreted signal. Priests and nobility were massacred when Spanish troops and Tlaxcalan allies overran the city. Temples were set on fire. There was no mistaking the message: send it in or die. Then the moment Moctezuma could not ignore arrived. Tenochtitlan, the Venice of the New World, was a floating city with glittering temples, canals, and stone causeways that Cortés was approaching. It was unlike anything the Spanish had ever seen, and it was built in the center of Lake Texcoco. Surprisingly, Cortés was accepted. Uncertain if Cortés was a god or a man, Moctezuma invited him to enter the city. Cortés had no intention of leaving, but the Spanish arrived like honored guests. In a bloodless coup motivated by terror and diplomacy, he took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. Now Cortés was within the empire, controlling it from the inside out. In addition to assuming power, he started destroying the Aztec world's spiritual underpinnings. Idols were demolished, temples vandalized, and crosses were placed in their stead. Cortés was not merely fighting wars, he was destroying civilizations one god at a time, brick by brick. And time was running out. There weren't many Spanish the city was observing, and opposition was starting to heat up in the shadows. The impossible had been accomplished by Hernán Cortés. Without a fierce war, he had taken control of the Aztec Empire's center. but it was a fantasy to hold a city of 200,000 people with only a few hundred Spaniards and some indigenous friends. Not much was needed to completely break the thin veneer of control, which was already beginning to disintegrate. Trouble simmered behind Cortés as he played the role of puppet master at Tenochtitlan. Diego Velázquez ordered a competing Spanish expedition to the shore to arrest him for insubordination. Cortés marched out to confront the menace after leaving the capital in the command of his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado. The city was in disarray when he returned after defeating the intruders and assimilating their men into his own. Why? What conquistadors accomplish best was what Alvarado had done. He slaughtered unarmed Aztec aristocrats at a religious celebration. Within a temple courtyard, thousands were massacred. The altars were saturated with blood. It was an inexcusable insult that set up a full-scale rebellion. Tenochtitlan blew up. The Spanish were stranded in a city they no longer controlled, besieged in the palace. The streets became death zones. They pulled up bridges. Anger, arrows, and stones were hurled. It was too late when Cortés returned with troops. The Aztec ruler Moctezuma, who was now a prisoner of his own hospitality, had passed away. Accounts vary. Some claim that because of his weakness, his own people killed him. Others report that when he became a liability, the Spanish killed him. In any event, his passing signaled the end of peace and the start of violence. Cortés was forced to escape. On June 30, 1520, in the dead of night, the Spanish made a last-ditch attempt to cross the causeways. The Aztecs stood by. Thousands of Tlaxcalan allies and hundreds of Spaniards were killed. Soldiers loaded with gold fell into the lake. It would always be known as the Night of Sorrows, or La Noche Triste. Cortés just about made it out alive. He fled to Tlaxcala, broken, bloodied, and humiliated. He wasn't defeated, though. He would get his bearings, and he wouldn't be an intruder or a guest when he came back. As a destructor, that is, blood had been drawn by the empire. Cortés would come back with fire now. Hernán Cortés did something that most men wouldn't do after the catastrophe of La Noche Triste. He returned more powerful. He withdrew to Tlaxcala and reassembled his army with tens of thousands of native allies in addition to Spaniards. Cortés found two more people who detested the Aztec yoke for every enemy he had created. He promised freedom, retribution, and a share of the spoils. It was successful. In addition, he constructed ships. Yes, ships are being pulled in fragments from the Gulf Coast across mountains and through jungles before being put back together on Lake Texcoco. The water was ruled by the Aztecs. Now Cortés intended to confront them at sea. It was the sort of crazy scheme that only works if you're either brilliant or desperate. The siege of Tenochtitlan started in May of 1521. Aqueducts and supply lines were severed by Cortés. The city turned into an island of famine encircled by water. Aztec canoes were destroyed when his brigantines, Spanish warships equipped with cannons, raced through the canals. The city was reduced to ruins as the Spanish and their allies battled their way inside it, street by street. The Aztecs, however, did not leave peacefully. The Aztecs battled fiercely under the command of Cuauhtémoc, the new ruler and nephew of Moctezuma. They set up ambushes, set traps, and resisted giving up. It turned into an annihilation and attrition war. Markets turned into battlegrounds and temples were overrun. Fire, famine, and disease did the rest. In the meantime, smallpox ravaged the populace, most likely brought in by a single Spanish slave who was infected. What steel and gunpowder couldn't do, the epidemic did. It decimated both priests and warriors, destroying entire neighborhoods. Tens of thousands of people are thought to have perished before ever seeing a Spanish sword. After 93 days of siege, the once powerful Tenochtitlan was reduced to a burning ruin on August 13, 1521. While attempting to escape across the lake, Cuauhtémoc was apprehended. Proud, defiant, and defeated, he was brought before Cortés. The dominion of the Aztecs vanished in an instant. Cortés entered the destroyed city as its conqueror rather than a guest. He had transformed a series of coalitions and audacious maneuvers into one of the most spectacular military triumphs in history. He didn't simply overthrow a ruler, though. He destroyed an entire civilization. They leveled temples. Codices were burned. Mexico City would emerge from the wreckage as a new capital. What about Cortés? The blood was ankle-deep, but he had conquered an empire. Standing on the ashes of a kingdom, Hernán Cortés saw Tenochtitlan reduced to rubble. Conquest, however, was only the first stage. When colonialism arrived, Cortés was keen to mold the Aztec world to reflect Spain. After being called Mexico Tenochtitlan, and then simply Mexico City, the city swiftly rose to prominence as the capital of New Spain. Catholic cathedrals were physically constructed utilizing the stones of the ancient gods where temples to Quetzalcoatl and Huitzilopochtli formerly stood. Not all rulers were being replaced by the Spanish. Reality was being rewritten by them. Cortés took quick action. He gave out encomiendas, which are land grants accompanied by native workers. In reality, it was slavery in all but name, even though Spain claimed it was a system of conversion and protection. Cooperating former Aztec aristocrats received lower titles. Those who objected were forever silenced. Tenochtitlan survivors had to deal with famine, sickness, forced labor, and unrelenting Christianization. Meanwhile, there was a difficulty with the Spanish crown. Without royal approval, Cortés had disobeyed orders, scuttled his ships, sparked a war, and established an empire. He had created his own version of the law, made himself a marquis, and dispersed wealth like a king. He was a hero to some. Others saw him as a dangerous outlaw with terrible ambition. The monarchy dispatched opposing officials, clerics, and inspectors to conduct an investigation back in Spain. Even though he kept some of his titles and honors after being called back to explain himself, the crown never again had complete faith in Cortés. As royal authority gradually regained control, his hold on New Spain gradually weakened. Nevertheless, the harm was done. Millions of indigenous people would perish over the ensuing decades, primarily from disease, but also as a result of war, forced labor, and cultural devastation. Entire cities disappeared, languages become less common. What was left was a world that was forever altered and included elements of Spanish and indigenous culture. By going on excursions into Central America in quest of new countries to subjugate, Cortés attempted to regain his power. However, he never replicated Tenochtitlan's victory. Rich when he returned to Spain, he was despised, sued, and gradually forgotten due to his political marginalization. However, his legacy could not be undone. Cortés had opened the floodgates with the fall of the Aztecs. Priests, settlers, and conquistadors flocked to the Americas in search of glory, gold, or God. Not only had he conquered a city, but he had permanently altered a continent. The Aztec kingdom was destroyed by steel and fire, but the Maya were a very other story. Even though Hernán Cortés had destroyed Tenochtitlan, he saw something much more irritating than a single city-state when he looked southeast toward the Mayan lowlands, a maze of kingdoms, jungles, and unending opposition. Cortés conducted an expedition into what is now Honduras and Guatemala in 1524, motivated by ambition and tales of riches and grandeur beyond the mountains. Another feather in his blood-stained cap, another sweep of conquering, was what was expected to happen quickly. It turned into a march through hell instead. The foes were elusive, the rivers were erratic, and the jungles were deep. Cortés faced dozens of Maya city-states, each with its own rulers, dialects, and resentments, rather than a single, centralized kingdom. They also didn't topple over. War was nothing new to the Maya. By the 9th century, many of their cities from the Classic Age had lost their guerrilla resistance traditions, walled settlements, and operational militaries. They ambushed from the woods, attacked supply lines, and vanished into the canopy. The Maya fought to tire, confound, and harass, in contrast to the Aztecs, who had ceremonial standards for battle. All they had to do was outlive their invaders, not win battles. Cortés razed certain towns, formed short-term partnerships, and threatened others into submission. However, he lost men to rebellion, famine, and disease for every win. His own troops started to doubt his judgment. He had to detain and execute his own followers for conspiracy in the midst of the bush, which was one of his most humiliating experiences. Little was accomplished by the Maya campaign. Although Cortés was able to establish Spanish rule over a few areas and make it to Honduras, he was never able to fully subjugate the Maya. Indeed, it would take until the late 1600s, more than a century after Cortés's death, to completely control some Maya settlements. The Maya were one of the longest-standing indigenous powers in the Americas because of the rainforest, their dispersion, and their tenacity. The trip served as a sobering reminder for Cortés. Not all kingdoms collapse as Tenochtitlan did. The Maya, who were anchored in silence, stone, and vines, would be more difficult to eradicate than the empire he had destroyed. Although Hernán Cortés introduced cavalry, swords, and muskets to the Americas, his most potent weapon was one that he was never able to control: illness. Smallpox, measles, and influenza had already started their silent extermination long before the last Aztec warriors perished. It is thought that an infected African servant who was traveling with one of the Spanish ships brought the first smallpox outbreak to Mexico in 1520. The conquest was altered from that point on. The Aztecs could resist the imposition of religion and defeat steel, but they were powerless against something they couldn't see, feel, or comprehend. Just as Cortés returned to lay siege, smallpox ravaged Tenochtitlan within a year, crippling the defenders. Whole families lost their lives in their houses. The people who kept the empire together, priests, generals, and city leaders, died within weeks. The illness destroyed resistance, morale, and social structure, in addition to killing bodies. The trend recurred when the Spanish advanced farther into Mesoamerica. Millions perished where Cortés had never even set foot. According to some estimates, waves of European illnesses, rather than fighting, killed out up to 90% of the native population of the Americas within a century of contact. Without a single Spanish sword ever being drawn, entire cities were reduced to ghost villages. Furthermore, illness altered everything in addition to killing. Survivors abandoned customs, ran away from home, and turned to new deities for guidance. Missionaries swiftly took advantage of the widespread belief that the plagues were divine retribution and offered baptism as a means of redemption. In this sense, Christianity came on a tsunami of biological apocalypse rather than only bearing crosses and lectures. Cortés recognized the importance of timing. Prior to his second attack, he witnessed directly how smallpox weakened the Aztecs. However, the long-term consequences extended well beyond strategy. Innumerable languages, customs, and oral histories were lost, agricultural systems collapsed, and the labor force was reduced in size due to disease. Without a monument, eulogy, or final stand, cultures were unmade in silence. Ultimately, Cortés's victory was a part of something more than a story of ambition and conflict. The Columbian Exchange carried epidemics in addition to horses and gold, and the price was unfathomable. Cities may have been overrun by the sword, but civilizations were overrun by sickness. Old, resentful, and mostly forgotten by the empire he helped create, Hernán Cortés passed away in 1547. He spent his last years fighting litigation, adversaries, and his own diminishing significance after being heralded as the man who brought down the Aztec Empire. Yes, he had gained an empire, but he had lost control of it. Once its most audacious conquistador, Cortés became an embarrassing representation of everything Spain feared and admired as it moved on. His legacy is a historical contradiction. Some saw him as a brilliant leader and a devoted Christian warrior who introduced civilization to the so-called savages, particularly in ancient Spanish chronicles. Others saw him as a brutal invader whose ambition resulted in widespread killings, the destruction of entire cultures, and the fall of one of the most advanced pre-modern civilizations. However, neither hero nor villain adequately describes Cortés. He was neither a great idealist nor a senseless butcher. He was calculating, cunning, extremely smart, and relentlessly ambitious. He played his opponents like chess pieces, formed alliances, and took advantage of splits. He used more than simply guns to conquer. It was about knowing when to burn temples, when to shake hands, and when to completely change the laws. What about the repercussions? Monumental. Centuries of colonial domination, the forcible conversion of millions to Christianity, and the transfer of unfathomable wealth from the Americas to Europe were all made possible by the fall of the Aztec Empire. It also signaled the beginning of a new world that was weird, in between, mestizo, hybrid, and irrevocably changed, one that was neither fully European nor native. Additionally, Cortés left a trail of unhealed wounds. He is viewed with rage and ambivalence in Mexico. His name used to appear on streets and in schools. Nowadays, many don't. There are monuments to him, but they are frequently covered in protest, graffiti, or dust. In addition to bringing Western architecture, Spanish, and Catholicism, he also destroyed entire cultures, languages, and temples. His remains are contentious as well, hidden, transferred, or buried. Like his tale, his bones are unable to rest in peace. Hernán Cortés, then, was who? Conqueror? Destroyer? The founder? A traitor? A visionary? Criminal? Or even worse, a man who altered history not because he was exceptional, but rather because he was ideally adapted to a violent, opportunistic era that rewarded brave men who took decisive action.